Good morning. I thought I'd show you what I go to work, well, what I go next. This is basically what's next to me every time I pass this way to work. It's one of the wonders of Gothenburg. Nothing fancy, but I think it's pretty nice. I love we have a few of these here, like light monuments, if you will. And I think I was so impressed when I first saw it, and I saw when they started building it, and I realized that it's kind of clever that in a town or like in Sweden, as I said before, I think most of the time of the year it's fairly dark here, so it does it makes sense in a way to have these LED light monuments instead. I mean, they really stand out. Anywho, so what I was going to talk to you guys about is what I think makes a programming language popular. Now, this is of course highly subjective, and there are many factors that play into determining when a programming language is going to be popular. There's so many things that will play in, but for me it boils down to three main concepts. Now, the first and foremost thing that is important for a programming language is how accessible is the syntax. In other words, it's very important that the actual expressiveness of the language is fairly well developed, and ideally it should be very close to something that's already on the market, because then the transition from one language to the other is much simpler. Now, if you look at languages such as JavaScript, C#, Java, and so forth, you will see that there is a strong correlation between these languages. They are very similar in terms of syntax. They do a few things differently, and some of the features are different, but features are, in my opinion, it's very rare that features are the thing that determines if you're going to adopt the language, yes or no. However, it is so important that it's easy to adopt the language. If you look at Haskell, and if you look at Objective-C, I will even go as far as to say that Objective-C is only here because it's an iOS specific thing. It would have never made it if it was anything else. If it was used for anything besides, if it wasn't this hard requirement for iOS, it would have never made it ever, because the syntax is way too different from anything else. And that's why I think that Haskell will never be a mainstream language. It's simply too different in terms of, when it comes to accessibility, and so beginners and people, even seasoned veterans, kind of cringe at the idea of having to learn it. So I think it's very important, and you see that for the most part the new languages, or the younger languages like Go and Rust and so forth, they have syntax that is at this point fairly standardized. And I question any language these days that put more emphasis on language syntax than anything else. That's why I know that Ruby claims to have the prettiest syntax in the world, and honestly, I just think they're being silly. I really do. I have nothing against Ruby. I like Ruby. It's a great language, but I really think that you're overhyping the importance of, the prettiest syntax or whatever. At the end of the day, we have a C and C++. They already had 99% of the syntax down, and most of the stuff we do today is a flavor of what these languages have been doing for 50 years. Anywho, that's the first thing. Second thing that's very important in my opinion for the popularity of a language is what you are going to be able to do with it. So every single language has to bring something to the table. You have to have an angle, you have to have something that stands out about your language. So JavaScript or Node has JavaScript on the server. That technology is, JavaScript is a popular language. So they're going with selling the idea of single-threadedness, asynchronous programming, easy accessibility, all that stuff. Go is a system-level language, same thing as Rust. They're emphasizing, native, or rather C++ performance, that type of stuff. And then you have C#, which going to be, so C# is going to have, offer you things as like Microsoft specific compilation, or rather Microsoft specific support. Java is, it runs everywhere, stability, that sort of thing. So you kind of get what I'm saying here. Like every language has that one thing that it brings to the table, or tries to. So, and then but it doesn't have to be just these hard values. It can be soft things as well. Like Ruby is selling itself on the idea of the best community and the best developer experience and so forth, which is, I think it's a fair, you can sell yourself on that too, because Ruby was really, really popular for a long time. And in many cases it still is. So if you think about that, that's like it's something that, like, depending on context, of course, you will see that this matters more or less. If you, as I mentioned earlier, like Objective-C has the benefit of being iOS specific, and if you want to do iOS development, well, Swift is around now, and that's the way things are going. But before that, Objective-C was on the market and popular, if you will, out of necessity. And it's the same thing with JavaScript. JavaScript it's the language of the browser, so it has this, like, it has an advantage to most other languages. These advantages you don't see in languages such as Python. So Python, for example, it's not tied so specifically to something. Like Java has Android, Objective-C has iOS, and JavaScript has the browser. So these languages have, like, I don't want to call it an unfair advantage, but it is an advantage to have hardware dependencies like that, so that you kind of you're forced to deal with these languages whether you like it or not. So that absolutely helps with adoption rate. Now, it's not a hard requirement that this is, you can go political with this, but I do believe that it's a major key, it's a key factor that your language has to do something differently. Because if it doesn't, I don't think, like, you may get adoption on this programming language, but you're not going to see like widespread you getting to the top of the top 5 languages or something like that if you don't offer something that is a little bit different. It can be a good package manager, it can be almost anything, but it has to speak to people. It has to make developers feel like they're getting something for learning your language, because otherwise, what's the point? And lastly, I think, and this is something I think that some languages do better than others, and JavaScript does the best. And the last thing is to have a really strong community around the language, because when it comes to sharing knowledge and having like relevant learning content and all of that good stuff, and package developers and all that good stuff, you should take that very seriously, because all that activity and innovation and so forth, it helps the language stay relevant and helps the language keep on developing. In my opinion, that's the fuel that drives things forward. Because, and my favorite example of how to neglect this to the point where it's almost silly is for C and C++. Now, I will argue that if C and C++ had the same community when they started out, now this was of course not possible because they started out way before everybody else, but in theory, if you just indulge me for a moment, in theory, I think that had they had the same type of strength and community like JavaScript has today, we would only be using those languages. C++, let's call it C++ because it's a little bit more modern. There would be no reason for us to use anything else. It would be the only thing that, or rather it would be the hands down the most dominating language in the world. And it's not, even though it should. It should be the best language we have, because it is. It's the most powerful we have. and most of the other languages are depending on that language to do their stuff. So why isn't it this monstrous super beast of a language that everybody uses for everything? Well, because it's not maintained. The community is not maintained. It is difficult to get started with. It is difficult to find good learning resources. It's very, very low level, and the libraries and the package dependencies and all that stuff all of that is managed extremely poorly by the community. And I'm sorry, guys, in my book, you're all geniuses for being able to be really productive in this language, but you have a really shitty community. I'm sorry. If you compare it to Ruby and Python and JavaScript, you have nothing in comparison. And I think that and that kind of strengthens the argument that I have for this. Same thing with Haskell and so forth. Popularity shouldn't be a factor, but it is a factor, and it's a fairly important one. I mean, even Java, who has, there's a lot of controversy around that language, has a lot of popularity, and it's one of the main benefits of that language is that the community is, although it's not the best community in the world, it's very broad. There's a lot of learning materials, there's a lot of content available, and you can get help, which usually we programmers do. Because remember, before we had this the easy access of the internet, people had to figure things out for themselves, and thank God those times are over, because you couldn't, today it's about knowledge sharing. It's about spreading what you know to the world, and having as much stuff as possible on the internet available for everybody to share. And if you don't do that, I think that if you're missing out on that, I think that your language will suffer for it. And so that's probably the third thing. And I think that that's one of it's a very important thing. So first and foremost, syntax, accessibility, making sure that the language feels similar and easy to learn. Second, it has to have something that stands out about it. In other words, what features does it have? What does it bring to the table? And lastly, community. Those are in my opinion, the three most important things when it comes to determining whether if a language is going to be popular or not.